Hello and welcome back to Joe's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical with me, your host, and your resident art historian, Joe McLaughlin. Welcome back, it is episode 49, and this week I'm joined by British artist Cherish Marshall, who will be sharing her love of all things Salvador Dali. This is a really good episode, guys, you're in for a treat. Salvador Dali is now an iconic artist whose art seems to have worked its way into the fabric of our everyday living. Much like artists such as Van Gogh, he is associated with certain items. So when you think Van Gogh, you think sunflowers. When you think Salvador Dali, you think melting clocks, surrealist landscapes, and almost nightmare depictions. Yet there's so much more to Salvador Dali than what we think. Cherish discusses 4 lesser-known works from the great artist and discusses beautifully why there is so much more to Dali than melting clocks and giant elephants. We discuss his Jeremy Kyle levels of a rather strange and unorthodox family upbringing, his love of bread, his later in life finding of religion and what that meant for his art practice, and just what a pivotal role he played in one of today's biggest sweet brands, Chupa Chups lollipops. And I'm completely serious, it's a big role. Cherish's love and passion for Salvador is so evident throughout, and I really can't wait for you to listen to this one. I would like you to note, however, a couple of times throughout the podcast, the audio does go slightly funny. It doesn't take away from the quality of the conversation, but it's just so you know, there's a little inconsistency in terms of volume and background noise at certain points. So all that's left to do is sit back and relax as Cherish and I discuss the brilliant Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali, what's your fascination with him? Where did you come across him? Can you remember your first encounter?
Yeah, actually. It was a painting called Galileo Spears, one of his later works, and it hung in my school library.
Okay.
And I just loved it. I was never taught him, but then I just kind of fell into him. And I absolutely adored surrealism. I love everything about it. I love its bonkers nature. And I know, as I will go on later, he was kicked out of surrealism. I know he's not the top dog of surrealism, but I still love him nevertheless.
He's somebody, first of all, I'm very impressed that your school had a painting of him up, because in my school, we didn't really have any paintings of modern or contemporary or surrealist artists. It was a very sort of religious school that I went to, like primary school I went to. And really we didn't start exploring paintings and things like that until we went to high school. So I love that there was just this random painting in your school. It's great. And I said before we pressed record, I've had an absolutely fabulously bonkers Sunday morning researching Salvador and looking into his weird and wonderful, fascinating life. And I completely understand why he continues to this day to completely capture the imagination of people around the world.
Oh, definitely. And he has made an impact in more ways than people realise. It's more than just a moustache. And it's just like, wow, he's done so much. And you could talk about him for hours upon hours. And people must specialise in just knowing about Salvador Dali. Well, I just love him.
Yeah, and even this morning, so I gave myself a good few hours before we started recording. I was like, right, here, okay, I'll give us a good couple of hours. And even nearing the end of the time I'd set aside, I was like, and knowing a little bit about him from my art history degree, I was like, that's not there. You can go in so many different directions.
Yeah.
But I must say, you've selected, and I applaud you for this, 4 slightly lesser known works of Salvador, which I thought is a great curveball. And because everybody knows the melting clocks, perhaps his weird, very surrealist elephants. I don't know the names of them off by hand, but I love the fact that particularly this first image that you picked, I would in a million years never think it was a Dali. It's so unusual.
With Dali, he experimented through so many themes and movements as well before he fell on to surrealism. But this first piece is just so beautiful and so sincere. So yeah, the figure at the window, I would love to try and pronounce it in Spanish. I can barely do it in English. So
same here. Thank goodness. I was like, oh my goodness, she's been fabulous and put all the Spanish names in.
We'll put it into context. It's fine, but I can't do the Spanish. I tried. It don't work.
Fine.
But no, he done it in 1925. So he joined the Surrealists in 1927. So a little bit before all of that. But it's just a painting of his sister. What I think is so beautiful.
Something very maternal. Is that
Yeah.
I don't know. Loving.
Yeah, it's just that loving connection that we don't really see with his more surreal artworks. You see it slightly if he's got Gala in there, like his wife, but everything else with him, it's just absolutely over the top, where this one's more subdued. It's taken down just a little bit. What's lovely. So
no, absolutely. And it's a really great way of setting the scene, because let's be honest, his home life and even how he came into the world was a surrealist in itself.
Yeah.
So do you want to explain to everybody a little bit of Salvador's background and his upbringing?
So we'll go as boring as he was born the 11th of May 1904, all those years ago. But unfortunately, even before he's born, he had turmoil in his life. So his older brother died 9 months and 10 days before he was born. His older brother was also called Salvador Dali. What's very confusing straight away, and everyone's like, what the hell's gone on here, you know? So of course, when he was born, he was almost claimed to be the resurrection of his brother. So where his mum was very Catholic in her beliefs, it's almost like this rebirth of her son to come back. But even as a child, that must be so bonkers, because he would visit the grave of his brother and he's looking at his own name. So
no, that's crazy.
As a young age, you're kind of looking at your own grave. What's very haunting.
Yeah, and you said in an email, in your email when we started sort of talking about this as a subject, and it made me laugh so much, and I didn't really get it until this morning when I read through everything again. I was like, it's so true. You said it's all very Jeremy Kyle.
Yeah, it's very Jeremy Kyle. It's Jeremy would have loved it. He would have been on a talk show. He would, been great.
Absolutely. And for all our non-UK listeners that are hearing this, Jeremy Kyle is a sort of a chat show in the UK, very much kind of like Jerry Springer and things like that, deal with sort of childhood trauma, weird things going on in the family. So he was his mother, and does his dad also say he was the rebirth of his dead?
Not that I could
brother.
read, but his dad was very atheist. Was atheist, sorry. So it was more his mum and that religious belief and the idea of rebirth and all that. I know him and his dad had quite a tempestuous time. They never really saw eye to eye, but his mum absolutely adored Dali. At age of 6, he wanted to be a cook. His mum supported that. At age 11, he wanted to be Napoleon. His mum also supported that, as you do.
Sure.
And then he finally come to a point where I will be a genius and the world will admire me. You know, how bonkers is that at a young age to even kind of go from step to step to step?
He's so fascinating, because he's definitely somebody, particularly later on in life, he definitely is obsessed with the concept of being himself, and which is, I get, could be a completely separate podcast episode in itself. He's such an interesting character, and the ego is incredible. You know, he had a very interesting relationship with his mother. He completely adored her, and they were very, very close. Yeah,
they were extremely close, and it was unfortunate for him that at age 16 his mother then passed from cancer. That really hurt him quite internally. But then the more messed up thing was, I want to say not long after, maybe a year or two after, his father then married his aunt.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Yeah, you know,
bizarre.
I know, keep it in the family and all that, but apparently Dali didn't have any annoyances with this, from what I can see and what's been written. But of course that would mess you up a little bit. That'd be like, okay, my figure, who I used to see as an aunt, has almost now become a mother figure in this weird way. And I've only just lost my mum. So already you can see his head must have been turning and ticking away, like, what is all of this?
Yeah, which in my reading is what I've understood anyway, is when he sort of looked to his younger sister, who was 3 years his junior. And this is when this beautiful series of paintings began to happen. So she kind of became his only model for until he married, which I think is lovely, actually, to sort of help your brother explore artistically and sit for him, because she would sit for hours and hours and hours, which if my brother asked me to do that, I'd be like, no.
No, we've got better things to do. Like, I want to watch the Netflix, mate. Like, off you go. You know, but that is such a beautiful bond there, isn't it? Just to sit and let your brother almost admire who you are. It's just gorgeous.
And this image in particular, it was displayed publicly, and like we said previously, it's just a very simple interior. It's the back of his sister, and it's a full-length shot, and she's just looking out of a window by the sea. So he grew up by the sea in Figueira. I think this is
correct.
It's so beautiful. And it was displayed in public, but it had a very famous admirer.
Wasn't it Picasso? Is that right?
Yeah. Again, speaking of artists with fabulous egos, I had read that Picasso celebrated this as a fabulous work because he found it very Picasso-esque.
Yes, of course.
Sure. Because
as all artists.
Absolutely, we all look for our own artistic endeavors in any painting that we look at. So I don't know if Salvador and Picasso were good friends at any points. I don't.
I think they did meet. Dali rated Picasso very, very highly in his books. Also, I can never pronounce his name, so I do apologise. Figueres, who also had a funny stash back way when. But they were like his two top people. He was like Picasso and him, absolutely fantastic people. So I'm not sure what Picasso thought of Dali, but I know Dali loved Picasso. So it must have been a beautiful compliment to kind of hear that. Like, it's very, well, you'd hope it's a compliment to hear. It's Picasso-esque at least.
Well, absolutely. And Picasso, again, was an absolute superstar in his day. So I think even as a young artist to have that sort of tip of the cap, if you will, from somebody like Picasso must have been so, I don't know, confirming it in terms of your talent and that you are sort of heading in the right direction. I think if anybody pays attention to you, when you're that young, it's got to be something important. But this was a whole series of paintings as well, and he had such a special relationship with his sister. I found this really interesting blog article about sort of the breakdown of Dali's family relationship, particularly after he released an autobiography in the 1940s called The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, which his sister, who had become almost this maternal figure in his life due to the passing of his mum, took great offence to.
Great. Like, the stuff, if you've read it, it's absolutely bonkers anyway. And trying to flick back and forth, because half of in the book he lies a lot as well in that book, because he makes things up and it heightens the story. But that did bring to their almost downfall, what's very heartbreaking.
Because he eventually stopped speaking to his family more or less throughout most of his life. And I read that I think him and his sister stopped speaking for about 40 years or something, and when she thought Dali was going to die, visited him in, I think, a hospital, and then they ended up having a humongous argument, and she got taken out of the hospital, and then they never spoke again. So there was, I don't know what happened. I couldn't find anything in my readings, but there was a lot of love loss and sort of tension in the family, which is strange. But I wondered, do you know anything about the later series? Because I know that when Dali released his autobiography, The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, his sister was so enraged she released a rebuttal.
Yes. I don't know all because I still yet to read her side of the story. What'll be quite interesting. But it's just silly little things. I think he accused his dad of being violent or whatnot during this argument and where they were back and forth, and Dali had great hatred for his dad at one point. He did send a letter to his dad, but also his sister, and he put, "Sometimes I spit for pleasure on my mother's portrait." So you're thinking, just that one line where he absolutely adored his mum, he looked at his sister as a mother figure, straight away that breakdown will just go instantly. So I know that was the main bite of it. And every time Dali was in the media, he would never be fully truthful about his family, so you can never quite know what fully happened. It's all fun and games.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's not very clear what's happening. What I did read though is when she released her rebuttal, like, and I think it's called something like Salvador Dali in the eyes of his sister.
Yeah.
And he then released this really awful painting of her, essentially being sort of a virgin being chastised. Hold on, let me get the,
of course, completely escaped my mind. Of course, yeah.
And it's quite a gruesome image, I must say. So the image is called "Young Virgin Auto-Sodomized by the Horns of Her Own Chastity."
That's the one.
19.
Yeah.
And this to me is surrealism. That I actually think it's a beautiful image. It's a beautiful painting. It's really, really out there. But it's, when you know the context behind it, you're like, what? I mean, I don't think I would be too pleased if because it's kind of just sort of poking at a family issue, isn't it? And sort of laying it out there.
And it's not even like, of course, a lot of artists talk about their family and all that, but it's almost petty. He spent the amount of hours, he spent hours on his paintings. You think about all that hatred in that one work, it's like, oh my God, like that would break your heart.
Even the title is just so nasty. But I'll leave a link to that article in the show notes below for anyone that's listening. But when I was reading it, it says that the breakdown really happened around meeting his wife in Gala.
Yeah. Good old Gala.
Can you tell us a little bit about Gala, because she was such an important figure?
So Gala was actually married to a surrealist poet, and Dali went on a holiday with the three of them. Well, it's a bit dodgy anyway. I think they were in a nice little pairing. Fair enough, do what you like. But later then Gala just then went off and lived with Dali. So Dali essentially took someone else's wife. But Gala was a brilliant businesswoman, and that's probably why Dali is such high up in the spectrum he is now, because without her, he probably wouldn't be as famous, but she knows how to get him out there. She knows what to do. And it's mainly because she is almost powered by money. She can be quite greedy. So what's fair enough. And that's when Anne-Marie, his sister, and Gala almost starting to get that tension and that falling out, because Anne-Marie was no longer the main woman of his life. It was now Gala, and Dali was smitten over Gala, even to the point when they weird turmoil relationship. But when Gala did pass away, his art started to deplete as well. He almost didn't fully stop making. He also had arthritis in his hands, but his passion broke down away with her as well. What was the shame?
I think that just kind of shows the love there, though, that he had for her, that he was so devastated that the creativity diminished, because he didn't live very, I think, was it a couple of years, because she passed away before him, and I think he only lasted a couple of years.
If I'm correct, maybe 2 to 3 years, but I could be wrong, but I believe it was.
I mean, they lived together, they worked together, and amazing that really she doesn't get more credit. It would be interesting to see if has she written anything about her life with Salvador. I mean, that would have been a fabulous read.
I don't think she has, but I'm gonna have to look into that more, because
same actually. I'm gonna look into that, because I love the idea of this sassy Russian coming in and being so driven by money and power, and being so in the heart of the surrealist, because was it her that introduced Dali into the surrealist circle?
It's helped like bring him in, and of course Louise Brunel, who done work later on, flooded up, and that's how his career started, really.
Or the second thing that you sort of brought my attention to was a film that Salvador has done. And I'll be very honest, I didn't think he did film. And this is something that's really surprised me in my research, is that he was so prolific and multidisciplinary.
Yes.
Like, he loved experimenting. He did furniture, jewelry, sculpture, painting, film. And before we hit record, I was saying to you, I watched this film, which is called The Andalusian Dog, which is the English name for it. Again, when I saw the Spanish name for it, I was like, oh, we won't be attempting that first thing on a Sunday. But I started watching it at 7:30. We're recording this on a Sunday. And it was, I think, the strangest one I've ever seen. To not your typical easy Sunday morning watching.
No. It's a bit of a shock.
Yeah, but you said in your notes to me that this is the piece that really helped Dali break into the surrealists. So was he trying to impress them as a circle? I mean, what's the whole story around?
So this film was made in 1929, and of course surrealism was already running for a few years by now, depending on what point you want to take it from and all that jazz. And he wanted to impress Andre Breton, because he saw this movement and he thought, oh, brilliant. So Louise Brunel, who was a film producer, film director, and done all the surrealists, so they collaborated together to make this such bizarre and this weird and wonderful film. I would always say to anyone, watch it.
Yeah, I would agree.
There's a few scenes where you might go a bit like, oh my God. It is a bit of a gut wrench in ways, isn't it?
Yeah, and surrealist is the only way I can describe it, really. And it's so staccato in terms of how it's very much sort of jumps about from some scenes to, there's no straight story through it. All these things keep happening. It's similar characters, but I had to watch, obviously it's black and white, so it's a silent movie, and sometimes it comes up with some wording, it's all in Spanish, but it really sort of jumps around a little bit in terms of what's going on, the people in it. Sometimes I had to go back once or twice to be like, wait, is that a new person or is that the same person?
It's almost like being in a dream or nightmare, however you want to compare it.
Yeah, but apparently it was inspired by a dream that Dali had, and a dream that his co-director had as well.
Yeah, so Dali said to Brunel, I dreamt last night of ants swarming around in my hand, and then Brunel replied with, good Lord, and I dreamt that I had sliced somebody or other's eye. And then he went, there's the film, let's go and make it. So two poignant points in the film with the ants coming out of the hand and the eyes being sliced.
Yeah, I mean, that the eye slicing, which is essentially within the first sort of 60 seconds of it happening, is so unexpected. Obviously it's not not a human eye that they're slicing, but they're trying to make it look like that. And it's I don't know, one of the things that really surprised me actually was when they were shooting on the street, there was just absolutely no cars there, but yet they these beautiful big boulevards full of...
Yeah, and you can't even think about that in today's age, can you? Because no matter what time you film anywhere, it's always chaotic. There's so much energy.
For anyone listening, this film is on YouTube. Again, I'll leave a link in the show notes for anybody, just for sort of easy sort of click through access. But when he made this, was the point to impress the surrealists? Was that the main objective, or he was trying to experiment in film? Because he was painting at this point in time, was he not?
I think, from my understanding as well, he wanted to impress them, because before this, he tried Cubism, he tried Futurism, he tried all these other movements, and then he saw surrealism. So it was that kind of introduction. But it's also, he loved experimenting. He wanted to understand the latest technology and understand what's going on. And there's a photo of him, what's fantastic, and you'd think in today's age it was photoshopped, and it's where water's splashing around him and things are floating in the air around him. And that was because a new idea of photography came along. Anytime there's a new medium, a new format. He just wanted to explore it and see how we can delve into it.
It's so interesting, and it's something that did cross my mind when I watched it. I was like, this must have taken forever to make, because it's not like it is today where you just click your phone and you go. Like there's so much that you have to set up, and even processing the film must have just taken forever. So I think, I don't know, I as bizarre as it was, I really respected the artistry behind it. What really stood out for me and made sense a little more once I read was, at one point the woman in the film is reading a book, and she puts the book down, and it's an image of a Vermeer painting, a Johannes Vermeer painting. He's really inspired by the great masters. He's obsessed with Vermeer. Raphael is somebody that he really looks up to, and I would never have put Salvador Dali being influenced by people like Vermeer or Raphael. He continuously surprises, and anybody that doesn't really know anything about Salvador, I would say just do a bit of reading about him, because it's like he's lived 10 lives in one.
Completely agree. And when you say about that idea that when you say he was inspired by the masters, when you first look at him face level, no, you don't. But you think about the artistry in his paintings. I remember he had an interview with someone. I can't remember who at the top of my head, but that was like, "Oh, are you a good painter?" He's like, "No, I'm not," because he would put all these artists before him at such a greater level than he ever was.
Yeah, I think in Glasgow there's a Salvador Dali, actually. No, it's definitely a Salvador Dali, and it's the St. John the Baptist. It's in the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery in Glasgow, and actually I think that might be the only Salvador Dali I've ever physically seen in real life. And it's such an unusual Dali because it's very religious, but we'll get onto that a little bit later, because which completely surprised me, he took a turn very later on in life and became exceptionally religious, and to the point that he's obsessed with it. But with this movie, to go back to the Andalusian Gogh, did he present this to the surrealists as a way of exhibiting that he was worthy of being in their circle? And what is the surrealist circle for anyone that's listening and doesn't really, because I don't really understand.
Surrealism is a strange movement. I believe, and I still believe, it is one of the longest manifestos. So it's a full-on book. So the manifesto is basically a whole book written by Andre Breton. Surrealism was going to come into with Tristan Cezanne, so who was the founder of Dadaism. But Cezanne was like, "No, I'm all right, mate. You do it by yourself." So it's Andre Breton, and Andre Breton was actually an automatic poet. So he was an automatic writer, and that's how that came to hand. And because he was inspired by Sigmund Freud. We all know Sigmund Freud. A lot of his theories are outdated now, but in the time must have been the grandfather of psychology. Absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
You can't fault him there. Many things you can fault him for, but he did start something so amazing, Freud. And a funny little fact is, Sigmund Freud and Andre Breton never got on, but Salvador Dali and Sigmund Freud did. What annoyed Breton greatly.
Oh.
Yeah, Dali actually met Sigmund Freud in his house in London. So yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. He met a lot of really interesting people.
Yeah. Dali met everyone. I swear.
He even met Jeff Koons, actually. Jeff Koons wrote to him as a young artist and invited him to come to New York to come and see him, which I just think is just so incredible that he's still having impacts on people that are like mega stars today. I mean, you're in the art world, you're always told it's who you know, you need to have connections. And I think some people are just great at doing that. And I think Dali was as well, because something we're going to talk about next, which is completely blown my mind. But before we get on to that, again, just talking about his ability to connect with people and his wide-reaching scope of connections is what I'm trying to say. But he showed this film to the surrealists and started sort of working with them, sharing their ideas. But it wasn't happily ever after, forever the end.
No. Was a shame for Dali. Dali would push it a lot with the surrealists, and I've gone to explain more as well why. Because Dali was he loved money. At the end of the day, he loved money, and Andre Breton thought art was a more purer form. It was art was art, and not just jazz. And he would easily wind up the surrealist. I know Magritte and Dali didn't get on very well. Magritte is who introduced him to Freud and all of this jazz. But it did end up in the trial of Salvador Dali. So there was a room, and basically Dali had to plead his case of why he was a great surrealist and why he is who he is. Unfortunately, during that, and I can't do the exact quote, but during that he did say that Hitler was probably the truest surrealist, and it's that not great to say, Dali. That hasn't aged well at all. It didn't age well back then, let alone now. You can't understand, but you see what he's trying to say is this idea of chaos and destruction, and Hitler done that perfectly, as we know. I do not credit him in what anyway.
Yeah, having a bizarre take on reality, or wanting to obscure the normality of reality, something like that. Yeah, it's quite a statement.
I love Dali. He does have some questionable actions, so I'm not saying he's perfect, but that's where he had the trial. Unfortunately, he could not plead his case to still be a surrealist. So technically, he was only a surrealist for 7 years.
I just love the fact that he was taken to trial by his peers for something that he said. So I applaud the surrealists for that. I mean, it might sound very severe, but yeah, you should hold people accountable for their beliefs and their words. And actually, if they don't align to your group, this is, of course, is he living in France at this time? Is he in Paris at this time?
Yes.
Or is he still in Spain?
Paris at this time, because I think he fled. It was around the time where, unfortunately, the wars were sneaking in.
We're sort of building back up again, yeah. And Paris, especially, was on Hitler's map of, let's take Paris. And initially, I was kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe he was like held to trial. But actually, thinking about it, I completely applaud the surrealists and sort of holding accountable to his words. But he essentially was in this air quotes trial. He was found guilty and kicked out. He was so ashamed that he fled to New York. Is this what happened?
He did fled to New York. Whether that was he's ashamed or there was more money in New York, I don't quite know. It depends where you come from on that thing. I like to hope he was ashamed.
Yeah.
However, there was a lot of money that way, so
I mean, it makes sense if opportunities are drying up, and I suppose if the surrealists were the hot ticket on the art scene there, if you've been sort of shunted or sort of from the group, you kind of want to distance yourself as much as possible. But he arrived in New York and just completely took off.
Yeah, he just took away. He was doing commercials and advertisements. He done a famous advert with a chocolate brand. It was actually a French chocolate brand as well, to tell lies. So, and it was, I'm crazy about Levin chocolate, and it was a very famous scene where his moustache would roll out and then roll back in. He done it for mints. He done it for anything. Anywhere you could not get away from Dali. He was the celebrity of your time. He was on every TV show. He done a quiz show of what is the show called? I want to say who is it or whose line is it? So you'd have to guess who the famous person is, and it's a brilliant scene. I'll send it over so everyone can watch. And it's a brilliant scene of where everyone's trying to guess who he is. So you'd ask the famous person questions like, "Oh, are you a chef? Are you an artist?" and all that. And he just kept saying yes to everything, because yes, he did write a cookbook. So yes, he was a cook. Yes, he done this, and yes, he done that. And it took him a little while, because he just was like, well, of course I've done it. I've done everything, essentially. I'm Salvador Dali. So that's how much of an impact he made just to the commercial world.
Wow. He's this part in particular really surprised me. But again, going back to something you said earlier, he was very, very money driven, and I read that his fee for a minute appearing on television for a minute was something like $10,000, which in the 1940s, 1950s, that is a lot of money. That is a lot of money.
Yeah. I don't even need to do the inflation to know he was minted. He was
Yeah. seriously wealthy, and mind-bogglingly so. But what I think this has completely blown my mind, this next fact. And this morning it was one of these things when I read, I was like, does everybody know this? And it's just me that didn't. But it's so Chupa, you've mentioned it there, Chupa Chups. What is Salvador's link to Chupa Chup lollipops?
Well, in 1969, Salvador Dali designed the logo for Chupa Chup. And you think it's mental. So the logo you see today is Salvador Dali's logo. It's been glammed up a little bit, but he was the main person for it. And he designed it so on a lollipop, you know, like when you twist it, he made sure his logo was seen. So it's at the top of the lollipop, so you can see that's his drawing, that's his design. So
it's just amazing. And again, sort of going back to what we said about his connections and that he knew a load of people. This happened because he knew the owner of the brand, he knew the owner of Chupa Chups, who had spent a load of money hiring a team to. So essentially, the lollipop was originally called, talk about a tangent, it was called Gogh in Spanish, and it was because the owner decided to put a sticky sweet on at the end of a pole because kids used to get sticky hands and they would get in trouble with their mum and dad. And I myself used to get in trouble for having sticky hands when I ate sweets. So it makes complete sense. But it was called Gogh because apparently the top looked like a ball and the goal was supposed to be your mouth. It didn't take off. So he hired this team. I was like, this makes complete sense. That's genius to me. But then he hired this marketing team. They came up with Chupa Chup, which is a Spanish proverb to suck on something.
Yep.
And then they were just having coffee one morning and he was telling Salvador Dali, oh, so this is what's happening with my lollipop brand. And Dali was, oh, do you need a logo? Great, we'll design it. And I think you said in your notes, they designed it on a bit of newspaper. And this then took me down an unbelievable rabbit hole of looking at his furniture, his jewelry, he's done so much. And I love the idea of that, the chocolate brand thing where his mustache, and I know exactly what you're talking about because there's a very famous one where his mustache is very, very straight.
Right. And then it curls back in.
It's just genius. But he was obsessed with marketing and imagery and power of images as well. But he really understood the power of imagery as well. As you said, moving it to the top of the lollipop, it means that everybody can see before you've even picked it out what lollipop it is. It's genius. And I said to my partner, I was like, do you know Salvador Dali designed the logo for Chupa Chups? And he was like, he did what? And I was like, I know. It's one of these great fun facts that I think people should put in a pub quiz just to annoy people.
I would love to do a pub quiz of just random artifacts because it's just this one, you would never know.
Yeah, maybe I should do one. I put together during lockdown on my blog, I put an art history quiz. Just like put it out, and I was like, oh, if anyone's doing, when in 2020 the world was stuck inside and everyone was doing quizzes every 2 days, and so I just did an art history one and I put it out there. So I don't know if anyone used it, but that is a great fact. So maybe we should do an art history quiz. Again, this was just something that made me think, my gosh, this guy really, he didn't pigeonhole himself. I think this is what I'm trying to say. And he tried everything and he experimented his whole life. He experimented with things.
And it's almost a shame that he is pigeonholed, that he's only really remembered border mounting clocks, existence of memory, or the grand elephants and all of this. It's almost a shame that it is, because he's done so much.
I don't know what's happened in that this has all been sort of lost in translation, that he has been pigeonholed, but it's something that I really appreciate, and I would seriously encourage people again to go away and have a look, because you think you know somebody just because you've been given a snapshot in art history. And I think society is great because people love to pigeonhole you. But much like Dali in that television performance that you were saying, like he didn't pigeonhole himself. Like the Surrealist Cookbook is a work of art in itself. It's beautiful.
It's gorgeous. It's illustrated beautifully. It's just all of it's stunning. I know there's some strange recipes in there, but it is just stunning.
Yeah, and I think there's some images that I found online, because I think they knocked together like a pretend version of some of the dishes. This chef worked with Dali, and they put together a couple of the dishes, and I found a recipe for a cocktail where the main ingredient is ginger.
Ooh.
And Angostura bitters, and it sounds horrendous, but when I was reading through it, I was like, and the reviewer was like, it's actually not terrible, like you could very easily drink this. So I was like, oh, how interesting. A Salvador Dali cocktail that Dali put together. Crazy.
That's for next Christmas.
Absolutely. So yeah, I loved that you threw the Chupa Chups in there. I really loved that. Like, probably one of the highlights of doing this podcast. And I love learning about art history. I think this, and again, this was just another moment where I was like, you are always learning when you do this. It doesn't matter how long or how often you study somebody, or people always surprise you. Just people are brilliant, and particularly Dali. This is really, I think I'm going to go and buy.
Do it. Honestly, you'll be reading it and be like, what on earth's going on? But you love it because it's just so mental.
But that's, I think, yeah, we need more weird and wonderful things like that. And I don't know, I really appreciate that he didn't pigeonhole himself. It's something that I keep coming back to. Like, he really loved it. The last thing that you sent me, again, I actually had to reread your sentence twice, because I was like, no, that I've read this wrong. It's too early. I've read this wrong. And then I was like, a bedroom of bread.
Yep.
So, and I said this to you before we started recording. So then I Googled Salvador Dali bedroom of bread, but I couldn't really find anything on it. But going back to what we said earlier with the whole, he's had 10 lives in one, later on in life, he had a bit of a spiritual reawakening.
Yeah.
Did he not? In terms of going back to the, so can you explain what happened in terms of his reawakening and what that then brought forth?
So in 1945, Dali wrote bread has always been one of the oldest fetishized and obsessive subjects in my work, the one which I have remained most faithful. So the idea of bread in Catholic is very poignant. It's the body of Christ. Now, Dali was brought up with his mum, who's Catholic, but his dad was atheist, so he did have this twist and turn, this turmoil that is brought up in a very scientific household, but yet a religious household. So that kind of brought him to this idea that he created called nuclear mystique. And you talked about the painting St. John, and it's almost like that idea of the fourth dimension, because when you look at it, you kind of see him from all angles. So at that point, Dali was trying to paint everything you can see all at once, the fourth dimension, but yet still having that religious strain. So that was that kind of weird fascination. With the bedroom of bread, I kind of put that funny thing in there because I found it out through I was watching a documentary one day about art and food, and it popped up, and I'm like, oh my god, it's a bedroom of bread. What on earth is this? And every time I try and find more information, and even this documentary, it's kind of been lost to history. But the bakery was I cannot pronounce this well, so I do apologise to the bakery. Polaine, and it was 2 bedrooms of bread. And the bakery, Perry Polaine, he, like Dali, was a socialite and knew everyone and anyone. And he just knew Dali, and he went, go on and do something wacky. And Dali made the bedroom, and apparently he made it to catch a mouse. As you do. Good old catch a mouse. but I kind of wanted to put the bedroom in there because the bread is just, it is so poignant. If you go to his theatre in Figueres, the whole outside, of course it's not bread, but it's like these clay models of just bread all around, these shaped bits of bread. And there's also another beautiful painting of his, and it's a hyper realistic painting of bread. He's done a few of them. And when you look at that, when I first saw that, I never thought that was a Dali piece, because I was like, boy, he don't do still life. He doesn't. And when you look at it, it is just gorgeous. It's stunning. And it was just always this idea, I think, having that object to try and almost coincide and understand a religion and a belief, but yet expanded that bit more. But just having that one object of bread was always just that fascination to him. Does that make sense in a strange way?
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. And when I'm thinking about bread, you know, it expands and contracts and hardens as it in its lifespan. And that kind of really speaks of, for me anyway, religion. It was so important, and then people kind of lost it, but then it's all, if you harden, it's always there. The idea of it's always there, and in the background is, I mean, I was raised Catholic. I went to a very, very Catholic high school, very, very Catholic primary school. I'm not practicing Catholic anymore, but the ideas and the iconography and the stories stay with you always. And I think it's, I don't know, but bread is the very important, is in a lot of the stories in the Bible, the, you know, the feeding of the 5,000, the bread, body of Christ. And I think it's very interesting that he's chosen that as a medium. And I just love the idea that he just thought, yeah, why not? And I think that's what he does brilliantly. He just goes, why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
And driven by money, absolutely. But I think that he can, if he can play with that concept of what is art, what is material, I just think it's fascinating. But the only image that I could find of the bedroom, even after googling it, because he, as you said, he continuously returns to the idea of bread, and the image that you're talking about, I saw, and I think that he painted that quite early on. Did he not paint the sort of realist in like the 1940s?
Yeah.
And even how he framed it, if you showed that to me, I would have been like, that's an old master.
Yeah.
That's a Raphael, that's somebody of that ilk.
Yeah.
Dali. It's beautiful. And again, I think just sort of tips the cap to the genius of him, because you need to really, to be a truly great artist, you have to get your basics right before you can then push it and take it somewhere that it's never been before. And I think that's what Dali has done and continues to encourage people to do.
The more you read about it, it's so you can spend hours just on one subject matter with them and keep expanding. And he was just, the fact he explored, the fact he mastered whatever he explored, that shows how much he did love his art. Like, I know I go on about the money, but he adored his art. You could tell that was his life. And during his later years, he did unfortunately get arthritis in his hands.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and also there was a fire in one of his homes that burnt a lot of his hands, and because he was caught in it, and it was the other surrealists that helped him get him out, actually. So towards later on, his love was gone, Dala. His passions were slowly losing, and it's heartbreaking to hear that such a masterful man was losing something he adored so dearly. So
I used to work with in a sculpture gallery, and we worked with a lot of, because our artists never retire. That's just fact. Artists never retire. And a lot of the artists that I worked with were in their sort of 70s, some in their 80s, and one of which was in his 90s. And he was a fabulous sculptor, but due to a stroke that he had 10 years before I started working there, he'd lost the ability very, very slowly to weld and make. And there's nothing sadder than your mind still being completely sharp, but your body, your your physical body letting you down, and it's just heartbreaking. And I can't imagine what it must have been like for someone like Salvador, who had so much to say in different
Yeah,
ways, and so much to explore, and playful, and encouraged other artists as well, because like we said, he met Jeff Koons. Jeff
yeah,
Koons was a really young man, and Jeff just wrote him a letter to say, I really love your work, it's been
yeah,
really important. He was like, oh, I'm in New York, come meet me. And I think to be that generous,
yeah,
as well as generous and genius, whatever anyone thinks of him, I have come away from this with a huge respect for Dali as
yeah,
an artist and his contribution within the history of art. He is a
yeah.
phenomenon.
I know people paved the way for almost like Warhol introducing everyday life to art, but I do think without Dali even having a slight influence on that, I don't think that would have expanded to even Warhol. Dali just brought everything in as best as he could, and he did bring art to the everyday people, even though it was a bit weird.
But again, then he posed important questions like, what is art? Like, art doesn't need to be this very traditional, rigid thing that we see in museums. You can throw a piano into an ocean as a performance piece and get people's opinions on it, because it's weird, but it gets people talking. And I think that's one thing about Dali. Even if you don't know anything about the history of art, you will definitely know, there's a couple of people that you'll definitely know. Like, you'll know Frida Kahlo, if not by name to look at. You'll know Dali. You'll probably know a Van Gogh.
Yeah.
And you'll definitely know the Mona Lisa. And you can talk about them because they're so iconic that they're just part of our everyday now, and so subliminal.
Yeah.
You've been exposed to them throughout your whole life in different ways, and there's no way that you haven't come across Dali in some respect. And if you haven't come across any of Dali's art, you have actually, because you've at least had a Chupa Chup.
Exactly. Well, it's just amazing that you can actually hold his artwork. It's just
I never even thought of that, Cherish. Absolutely, you can hold a work of Dali. You can buy a Dali for 50 pence in the shops. It's there. Go to Chupa Chup. Oh, I love it. Cherish, I have loved talking to you about this. Thank you so much for coming on. Your passion has completely shone through. It's been infectious. I loved researching this, and I could have talked to you for about 4.5 hours. I really could, because there's so much to say. But thank you so much for the works that you chose and for coming on. I've absolutely loved talking to you.
Thank you. I love talking to you. I love talking about Dali, and I wanted to do some more abstracted side of him as such, the ones you don't really know of. So I'm glad that I could do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cherish, before we go, where can people find you and connect with you and know what you're up to?
So that's on Instagram at Cherish Marshall. You can see me there, and just my website, www.cherishmarshall.org. So all there.
And for everyone listening, I will leave the links to that in the show notes below. So Cherish, before we go, I have one last question, and it's the question I try and end most of my podcasts on, if and when I remember it. And it's quite a big question, so you can take it as personal or as large as you want it to go. And the question is, why is art important?
It helps people escape reality, and that's why I fell into surrealism and why I fell into Dali, is because at times, especially in these years, reality can be a world that you don't really want to live in for a little while. So it's nice to escape it, but also what artists do, even though they escape it, they feed it back to everyone else. So it can almost, why it does tell the everyday life, it can also tell the more internal life that I think's very nice to see and loving to see, and how we can all relate to.
Yeah.
It's a very cheesy answer, but there you are.
No, not cheesy. I love it. And it's so true though, like, and particularly the last 2 years, art has been my crutch that I have escaped into, and the conversations that I've been able to have, this is why I started the podcast, like the conversations I've been able to have with people around art have just helped me forget of the dumpster fire that's happening out in the world. And it's been an amazing way to connect with people and realise things about myself. And yeah, it's not cheesy at all. I completely empathise with you. A brilliant answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. So yeah, it's been great fun.
And there you have it, another episode of Jo's Art History podcast. Once again, I just want to thank Cherish for coming on and speaking so brilliantly about Salvador Dali. I had so much fun researching this episode, and if you were active at all that day on Instagram, and if you follow me, you would have seen that I was very excited and had a few sort of mind-blowing moments in researching for the episode. So really great fun, and absolutely loved speaking to her. So thank you once again, Cherish. I would, however, like to apologise for the audio. At times there was a lack of consistency in terms of volume, and there seemed to be a little bit of background noise, which I didn't pick up when we were recording. I'm not too sure whose side that was on, but if it annoyed you at all, I do apologise. But as you will see, it didn't take away from a great conversation, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to get in touch, please feel free. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Instagram @joesarthistory. If you'd like to see the images which Cherish and I discussed throughout this episode, if you go along to my Instagram highlights reel and find the number that corresponds to this podcast episode, so I believe this is number 49, so if you go along to 49, you'll find all the images in order that we discussed them. You can now also leave a review of the podcast on iTunes and on Spotify, as well as making sure that you like and subscribe on YouTube. If you can do either one of the three or all three, I would be very, very grateful. Also, if you were listening to this and think of someone that would benefit from hearing this episode, please feel free to pass on the podcast to them. It would be great to get as many people listening as possible. Finally, I'm Jo McLaughlin, your host and your resident art historian, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on Jo's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art really is for all. Bye.